Baltimore, Maryland, 2013. A federal investigation uncovers something that stops even veteran law enforcement officers cold. Not a drug bust, not a murder conspiracy, not a weapons cache. Something that nobody in the history of American corrections had ever fully documented before. A prison gang so powerful, so feared, so completely in control of what happened inside the walls that other gangs were coming to them. Not to fight, not to challenge, to pay, to ask for protection, to negotiate for the right to exist in the same facility without consequences. The most violent men in the American prison system, men who had spent their entire lives taking what they wanted through force, were lining up to pay tribute to one organization. And it wasn't just street gangs, organized crime figures, men connected to some of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country, men whose names made other men nervous on the outside, were inside the walls doing the same thing, coming to the table, paying what was required, because the alternative, making an enemy of this organization, followed you from facility to facility, from transfer to transfer, across state lines and into the federal system. You could not escape them by moving because they were already there. They bought Mercedes and BMWs from inside prison cells. They ran drug operations that extended from the yard through the gate and into the streets of cities across America. They corrupted corrections officers, politicians, lawyers, and judges from behind bars. They built an intelligence network inside the most controlled environment in American society that outperformed the guards watching them. The FBI classified them as one of the most violent federal racketeering enterprises in the United States. Their name was the Black Guerrilla Family. And what one of their members did to a maximum security detention center in Baltimore, what he did to the guards, how they got girls pregnant, what they did to the institution, to the entire system meant to contain them, is the story that tells you everything about what this organization actually was. That story is coming. But first, you need to understand where this all began. One man, one prison cell. 1966. Chicago, Illinois, 1941. George Lester Jackson is born on the South Side, second of 5 children. His father, Alexander, works for the post office. His mother, Georgia, holds the family together. They are not wealthy, but they are stable, a working-class black family trying to make a life in a city that has never fully decided whether black people belong in it. Jackson grows up fast. Chicago's South Side in the 1940s and 50s is already hardening into the geography of segregation, redlined neighborhoods, underfunded schools, police who treat black teenagers as suspects by default. He gets into trouble young, petty theft, running with older boys, the kind of escalation that the city's juvenile system handles by moving kids through a revolving door of facilities that teach them nothing except how to survive among other young men who have also been failed by everything around them. In 1956, at 15 years old, Jackson is sent to the Illinois Youth Commission after a series of arrests. He spends time in reform school, comes out, gets into more trouble. His family moves to Los Angeles trying to give him a fresh start. It doesn't work. In 1960, 19 years old, George Jackson and a friend rob a gas station in Pasadena, California. The take is $70. $70. He is caught 2 days later, convicted of armed robbery. And here is where California's justice system does something to George Jackson that will define the next decade of American history. The judge sentences him to 1 year to life. Not 1 year, not 5 years, not 10 years. 1 year to life. An indeterminate sentence, meaning the California Adult Authority, the parole board, decides when George Jackson gets out. and they can keep him inside for as long as they determine he is a threat to society. For stealing $70, George Jackson enters the California prison system at 19 with no release date. He would spend the next 10 years in that system, 7.5 of those years in solitary confinement. Think about what that means. 7.5 years in a cell, 23 hours a day, alone with your thoughts, with books, with letters, with the creeping understanding that the system that put you there was not interested in rehabilitation. It was interested in control. Every 6 months, Jackson would appear before the parole board. Every 6 months, they would deny him release, citing disciplinary infractions, citing attitude, and citing the revolutionary literature he was reading and writing about in letters that were already being monitored by prison officials. This was how parole worked against him. The more radicalized he became, the longer they kept him inside. The longer they kept him inside, the more radicalized he became. It was a perfect machine for producing exactly what it claimed to fear. Before we go back to where this all started, you need to understand what one BGF member did inside a Baltimore detention center. It tells you everything about how deep this organization's power actually ran. His name was Tavon White. He was not the founder, not a legend, not a man whose name had been feared for decades inside the system. He was a member, doing time inside the Baltimore City Detention Center. And from inside that cell, he built something that broke across every major news network when federal investigators finally unraveled it. He had been sleeping with female corrections officers. Not one, not two. One by one, he identified them. He studied them. He understood their vulnerabilities. He made each one feel like she was the only one. He made each one feel seen and valued in a job that grinds people down and treats everyone inside those walls, guards and inmates alike, as interchangeable. 4 of those female corrections officers became pregnant. All 4 children were his. DNA confirmed it. Not one test, 4 separate DNA tests, 4 separate pregnancies, 4 separate women who were employed by the state of Maryland to keep order inside that facility, who were instead carrying his children while smuggling drugs, cell phones, and cash through the gates for him. The New York Times covered it. CNN covered it. ABC covered it. Fox News covered it. Every major outlet that touched the story used the same word: unbelievable. But it was not unbelievable. It was in the federal indictment. It was in the DNA evidence. It was in the guilty pleas of 7 correctional officers who admitted they had been working for the BGF from inside the facility. 7 corrections officers pleaded guilty to federal racketeering charges for a prison gang. And Tavon White, the man at the center of all of it, was not running the BGF. He was not giving orders to the entire organization. He was a member doing what BGF members do inside the walls, building power, holding it, expanding it. If this is what a member could accomplish, imagine what the organization itself looked like. Now go back to where it started. 1969, Soledad State Prison. The California prison system is a powder keg. The civil rights movement is reshaping black political consciousness across the country. The Black Panther Party is organizing in Oakland, 40 miles from San Quentin. Inside the prisons, black inmates who have been absorbing the same political energy are beginning to organize in ways that prison officials have never seen before. The Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist prison gang founded at San Quentin in 1964, has been targeting black inmates with escalating violence. On January 13, 1969, a white guard at Soledad Prison allows a group of black and white inmates into an exercise yard together. A fight breaks out. 3 black inmates, W.L. Nolan, Cleveland Edwards, and Alvin Miller, are shot and killed by a tower guard. A grand jury rules the killings justifiable. 3 days later, a white prison guard named John Mills is thrown from a third-tier landing at Soledad and beaten to death. 3 black inmates are charged with his murder. One of them is George Jackson. The Soledad brothers, as Jackson, Fleta Drumgo, and John Clutchette become known, become one of the most high-profile political prisoner cases in American history. Angela Davis joins the defense committee. The case draws international attention. Jackson's letters from prison, raw, brilliant, furious, are circulating in revolutionary circles across the country. And while the legal case builds around him, George Jackson is working on something else, something that will outlast the trial, outlast the headlines, outlast him. San Quentin State Prison, 1966. 3 years before the Soledad incident, while Jackson is still in the early years of his incarceration, he meets a man named W.L. Nolan. Nolan has been in prison since 1963. He is a political intellectual, a street fighter, a boxing champion inside the walls. He and Jackson recognize something in each other immediately. The same rage, the same intelligence, the same conviction that what is happening to black men in California's prisons is not an accident. It is policy. Together with George Big Jake Lewis and a handful of other black inmates, they found an organization. They call it the Black Guerrilla Family. The name comes from something Jackson had written in his letters, describing the men who had introduced him to black power as some real black guerrillas. They take the name as a statement of intent. The stated goals are written down and distributed among members. Promote black power inside and outside the prison walls. Maintain dignity and humanity for black prisoners in a system designed to strip both. Resist the racism of the California correctional system at every level. And stated plainly, without apology, overthrow the United States government. They model the organizational structure on the military, ranks, responsibilities, a chain of command that can survive the transfer, the isolation, even the death of individual members. A written ideology, eventually formalized as the Black Book, that members study and internalize. This last detail is what separates the Black Guerrilla Family from every other prison gang in American history. Most prison gangs are organized around violence and money. They exist to control territory and extract resources. Their structures are hierarchical but fragile, dependent on the personal authority of whoever sits at the top. The Black Guerrilla Family is organized around an idea, and ideas are much harder to kill than men. The California Department of Corrections recognizes this immediately. They begin monitoring Black Guerrilla Family members with an intensity usually reserved for foreign intelligence operations. They classify any book, magazine, or letter that mentions George Jackson's name as contraband. They transfer Black Guerrilla Family members constantly, moving them between facilities to prevent the organization from consolidating power in any one place. It doesn't work. The transfers spread the Black Guerrilla Family instead of containing it. By 1970, the Black Guerrilla Family has presence in multiple California facilities. Its members carry the organization's structure and ideology with them from Soledad to San Quentin to Folsom like seeds. Everywhere they land, the BGF grows. The California prison system in the late 1960s and Bonsau and early 1970s is a war zone, not metaphorically, literally. The Aryan Brotherhood, white supremacist, ruthless, organized around a simple principle of racial violence, has been systematically targeting black inmates for years. They have alliances with the Mexican Mafia, the largest and most powerful Hispanic prison gang in the California system. The BGF is on the other side of that equation, and they are not interested in peaceful coexistence. What follows is one of the most sustained and violent conflicts in the history of American corrections. Stabbings in exercise yards, bodies found in cells, riots that require full lockdowns, and the deployment of tactical units. The violence moves through the system, with the BGF and its rivals like weather following the transfers, surfacing in new facilities, receding and returning. The BGF develops its own military doctrine. Members are trained in hand-to-hand combat. Weapons, shanks fashioned from anything that can be sharpened, are cached and distributed through networks that prison officials cannot fully map. They also develop something more sophisticated than violence. Intelligence. BGF members communicate through a system of coded letters, legal mail that prison officials cannot legally read without cause, and verbal messages carried by inmates being transferred between facilities. They map the movements of guards. They identify which officers can be pressured or bribed. They track which inmates are cooperating with prison officials and act accordingly. The BGF is running an intelligence operation inside the California prison system, and they are better at it than the guards watching them. The Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood have more numbers in certain facilities and more raw violence in certain yards. But the Black Guerrilla Family, or BGF, has something neither of those organizations ever developed: institutional memory. A written ideology gives members a framework for understanding their situation that extends beyond the immediate and the personal. A structure sophisticated enough to survive decades of deliberate government disruption. When other gangs look at the BGF, they do not see just another prison gang. They see something that operates on a different level entirely. And some of them make the same calculation that smart men make when they encounter something more powerful than themselves. They come to the table. August 21st, 1971. San Quentin State Prison. George Jackson has been in prison for 10 years. The Soledad brothers' case is still ongoing. The legal fight is consuming enormous resources from the Defense Committee. Angela Davis, who has been in correspondence with Jackson and who considers him her companion, is now facing murder charges stemming from a courthouse incident connected to Jackson's case. 3 weeks before his scheduled court appearance, Jackson is being escorted back to his cell after a legal visit. He produces a gun. The weapon, a Spanish-made automatic pistol, has been smuggled into the facility. The method has never been fully established in the public record. Jackson moves through the cell block. Guards are taken hostage. 3 white inmates are killed. 3 guards are killed. And then in the exercise yard at San Quentin, George Jackson is shot by a prison tower guard. He dies in that yard, 29 years old. What actually happened in the hours before his death remains disputed to this day. Prison officials say Jackson was attempting a prison break, that he was armed, that he killed, and that the tower guard had no choice. Jackson's supporters, and there are many across decades, say something different. They say Jackson was murdered. They say the California prison system, which had been trying to contain his influence for years, found a justification to put him down permanently. They say a man who had spent 10 years building an organization powerful enough to challenge the system was too dangerous to allow to walk out of San Quentin alive. The truth, whatever it is, died with him in that yard. What did not die was what he built. The black community mourned George Jackson with the specific grief reserved for men whose death feels like a deliberate erasure. Internationally, in Europe, in Africa, and in the revolutionary movements of 3 continents that had claimed him as one of their own, his death resonated. In the prisons, his death sent a message. The message the California correctional system intended: see what happens when you push too far. The message the BGF received: we have to be stronger than any individual member Because individuals can be killed, organizations survive. After Jackson's death, the BGF changes, not immediately and not all at once. But over the course of the 1970s and into the 80s, the revolutionary ideology that Jackson had built the organization around begins to erode. The men who had been radicalized by Jackson directly, who had read the same books, absorbed the same political framework, and believed in the same goals, age out, die, or are transferred so many times that their influence becomes diluted. The men who replace them come to the black guerrilla family through the streets rather than through political consciousness. They know the name, they know the structure, they respect the history. But the goal of overthrowing the United States government feels abstract to a man who grew up in South Central and learned about the BGF from older inmates who told him it was the most powerful organization in the yard. What those men understand, what they have learned from the streets, is power. And power in prison looks very specific. It looks like who controls the drug supply inside the facility. It looks like who decides which conflicts get resolved and which ones escalate. It looks like who the guards are afraid of and who the guards are working with. By the 1980s, the BGF had become both things simultaneously. The revolutionary ideology survives in the organization's documents, its symbols, its self-understanding. Members still study the Black Book. The dragon, the BGF's symbol climbing a San Quentin prison tower, still means something, but the organization's day-to-day operation is a criminal enterprise. Drug trafficking inside prison walls occurred on a scale that dwarfs what most street organizations manage on the outside. The BGF controls supply chains, product coming in through corrupted guards, through visitors, through the mail, through networks so sophisticated that federal investigators spend years mapping them without fully understanding the whole picture. The money generated inside the walls flows outward through those same networks. BGF members sit in cells directing associates on the outside, making calls, giving orders, controlling street gang activity in neighborhoods across California and, eventually, across the country. They buy cars, expensive cars, Mercedes-Benz and BMWs, registered to associates, funded by money that flows from a prison cell through a series of hands that federal investigators trace with difficulty and never completely. The California Department of Corrections transfers BGF members to federal facilities trying to break the organization's grip on the state system. The BGF follows them into the federal system and from there, east to Maryland. Here is what made the BGF fundamentally different from every other prison gang in American history. They did not just accumulate power, they accumulated legitimacy. There is a difference. Power in prison can be taken by anyone willing to use enough violence. The Aryan Brotherhood understood that. The Mexican Mafia understood that. Raw violence, the credible threat of it, the willingness to use it without hesitation, creates a kind of power that functions inside any facility. But legitimacy is different. Legitimacy is what happens when an organization has been operating with the same structure, the same principles, the same chain of command for so long that other organizations accept its authority not just because of fear, but because of recognition. The BGF had been building that legitimacy since 1966. By the 1980s, they had been operating continuously for nearly 20 years inside one of the most hostile environments imaginable. They had survived the deaths of founding members. They had survived the systematic disruption of the California correctional system. They had survived race wars that killed dozens of their members. They were still standing, and they were more organized than when they started. Other gangs took notice of this in a specific way. The Aryan Brotherhood, the BGF's most consistent enemy, at times found it more useful to negotiate with the BGF than to fight them. Not out of respect for the BGF's political ideology, but out of recognition that the BGF could be a more useful ally than an enemy in specific situations, particularly when the real conflict was over drug supply and territory rather than race. Organizations that came to the BGF, smaller gangs, newer groups that lacked the BGF's institutional history, came with propositions. We will work within your structure. We will pay what you require. We will not move on your territory. In exchange, leave us alone. Let us operate. Protect us from those who would otherwise target us. This is protection in the most literal sense, not the BGF hunting down other gangs to extort them, but other gangs coming to the BGF and asking to pay for the security of operating under their umbrella. The BGF had become inside the walls exactly what Lucky Luciano built on the outside in 1931 when he created the Commission, a governing body, a structure that other criminal organizations recognized as having authority over disputes, territory, and the basic rules of engagement. George Jackson had wanted to overthrow the government. Over time, his organization became the government of the prison system. 2013, Baltimore City Detention Center, Maryland. The BGF expansion to the east, from California through the federal system and into Maryland, has been building for years. Baltimore's jail population is predominantly black. Many of the men cycling through the Baltimore City Detention Center have street connections that predate their incarceration, gang affiliations, drug network relationships, debts, and loyalties that do not stop at the prison gate. The BGF moves into this environment and does what it has always done. It organizes. And at the center of the Baltimore operation, the BGF member who becomes the focal point of the federal investigation is a man named Tavon White. White is inside the Baltimore City Detention Center doing time. And from inside that facility, he builds something extraordinary. He identifies corrections officers. Specifically, he identifies female corrections officers who are susceptible to manipulation, who have financial pressures, who are lonely, who are looking for something that the job, the facility, the institution does not give them. He develops relationships with them. Not one, multiple simultaneously. He is charming. He is attentive. He listens. He makes women who spend their days moving through a facility full of dangerous men feel seen and valued and important. And then, once those relationships are established, he activates them. Can you bring something in for me just this once? Just this one thing. And once they do it once, they can never stop. Because once a corrections officer smuggles contraband into a facility, once they are compromised. The BGF owns them. Not because the BGF threatens them with violence necessarily, but because the BGF holds information that ends their career, their freedom, their family's stability the moment it reaches investigators. So they keep going. Drugs flow into the Baltimore City Detention Center through women who are supposed to be keeping drugs out. Cell phones flow in, giving BGF members inside the facility unrestricted communication with their network on the outside. Cash flows in, funding the operation, paying debts, rewarding loyalty. The BGF runs the Baltimore City Detention Center's contraband economy so completely that the facility's official administration, the warden, the deputy wardens, the captains, are operating in a facility they nominally control but do not actually run. The people who actually run the Baltimore City Detention Center work for Tavon White, and Tavon White works for the BGF. When federal investigators finally move, the indictment is extraordinary in its scope. 25 BGF members and associates charged. Federal racketeering, drug distribution conspiracy, Weapons charges. 7 correctional officers pleading guilty to conspiracy. The federal indictment uses a specific phrase to describe what investigators found. The BGF controlled the Baltimore City Detention Center, not influenced, not operated within. Controlled. 4 female corrections officers are pregnant by Tavon White at the time of the indictment. 4. In a maximum security detention facility. The investigation reveals how complete that control was. BGF members giving orders to corrections officers. Officers following those orders. BGF associates on the outside communicating with members inside through cell phones that corrections officers had smuggled in. Money moving in both directions. Drug distribution operating simultaneously inside the facility and on the streets of Baltimore, coordinated through the same network. The warden of the Baltimore City Detention Center, when presented with the evidence, cannot explain how he did not see it. The answer is simple. He was the warden of the building. Tavon White was the warden of everything that happened inside it. Step back. Look at the full arc of what the Black Guerrilla family built from 1966 to 2013. Built. George Jackson, 19 years old, a $70 gas station robbery, 1 year to life. He reads everything he can find. He writes letters that become internationally published books. He builds an organization inside the most hostile environment in American society, a maximum security prison system designed explicitly to prevent exactly the kind of organizing he is doing. Organization. He dies at 29. Dies. The organization survives. It spreads through the California system. It develops military discipline. It fights a race war against the Aryan Brotherhood and the Mexican Mafia, and it does not lose. It builds an intelligence network inside prison walls that rivals anything the correctional system can develop against it. Military. It transforms, after Jackson's death, from a revolutionary organization into a criminal enterprise. But it carries the organizational sophistication of its revolutionary origins into that criminal enterprise. It becomes the most institutionally durable prison gang in American history because it was never just a gang. Criminal enterprise. It was a movement. And movements, when they lose their ideological center, become institutions. The BGF becomes an institution, one that generates millions of dollars from prison cells, one that buys cars from behind bars, one that corrupts judges, lawyers, corrections officers, and politicians across 2 states, one that controls the drug supply in facilities from California to Maryland, one that other organizations, some of the most violent men in America, come to with requests rather than weapons. Millions. Tavon White impregnates 4 corrections officers in a maximum security detention center. Tavon White. 7 officers plead guilty to federal racketeering. Guilty. The federal government describes what he built as a controlling interest in an entire correctional facility. Controlling. And Tavon White is not the founder, not a leader of historical significance, not a George Jackson. He is a mid-level BGF member doing what BGF members do. Mid-level, what George Jackson designed the organization to do. Designed. Build power. Hold it. Expand it. Power. George Jackson went to prison for stealing $70. 70. The organization he built in response to that injustice became one of the most powerful criminal enterprises in American correctional history. Powerful. He wanted to tear down the prison system. Tear down. He built something powerful enough to own it. Own. That is the Black Guerrilla family. Family. That is what happens when you take a brilliant, furious young man who has done nothing worse than hundreds of thousands of others who walked free and give him a cell, a library, and nothing to lose. Brilliant. He builds something, builds, and what he builds outlasts everything they throw at it. Outlasts. Subscribe to Bloody Reports. There are 1,000 stories like this one that nobody has told properly yet. This was one of them.